The Age of Illusions. In the late 1930s, a palpable tension hung in the air of Europe, a stark contrast to the determined optimism that characterized the United States. Across the Atlantic, a nation was still grappling with the long shadow of a great economic downturn, finding solace and purpose in the marvels of consumerism and peacetime innovation. It was a land of gleaming automobiles rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, of refrigerators becoming staples in kitchens from California to Maine, and of countless small conveniences, like safety razors, that defined a modern, comfortable way of life. The American industrial landscape was a testament to mass production, but its output was geared towards comfort, not conflict. The rhythm of its factories was the hum of progress, the creation of a domestic dream, far removed from the drumbeat of marching boots and the roar of military engines that was beginning to echo across the old continent. From the perspective of the rising powers in Europe, this focus on civilian goods was not a sign of a different priority, but of a fundamental weakness. They saw a culture entranced by chrome, plastic, and domestic ease, and they made a critical miscalculation. They mistook a choice for an inability. At the forefront of this dismissive chorus was Hermann Goering, the powerful and ostentatious head of the German Luftwaffe. A man of immense ambition and equally immense confidence, Goering was the architect of what was, at the time, the most formidable air force the world had ever seen. The Luftwaffe was his pride, a symbol of a new, technologically advanced Germany, forged in the fires of nationalistic fervor and precision engineering. Its aircraft, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Junkers Ju 87, were the sharp point of a new doctrine of warfare, one that promised swift, decisive victories through overwhelming air power. Looking eastward, Goering saw a continental rival in the Soviet Union, a nation of vast resources, but questionable industrial efficiency. Looking across the English Channel, he saw a traditional foe in Great Britain, with its venerable but, in his view, aging Royal Air Force. But when he looked across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, he saw something else entirely. He saw not a threat, but a caricature. He saw a nation of merchants, entertainers, and factory workers who, in his words, were exceptionally skilled at making razor blades and refrigerators, but possessed neither the will nor the know-how to forge the instruments of modern war. This sentiment was not his alone. It permeated the highest echelons of the German High Command. The American military was small, its equipment was largely outdated, and its industrial base, while enormous, was seen as hopelessly entangled in the complexities of capitalism and consumer demand. The idea that the sprawling, chaotic, and individualistic factories of the United States could be harnessed and redirected towards a single, martial purpose seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. The German model was one of centralized control, of state-directed priorities where the needs of the military were paramount. The American model, with its competing corporations, its labor unions, and its focus on quarterly profits, appeared to be the very antithesis of efficiency. In the year 1939, the numbers seemed to support this confident assessment. The Luftwaffe could field approximately 4,000 modern combat aircraft, a fleet of bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes that had been tested and refined. The United States Army Air Corps, by contrast, was a pale shadow, possessing fewer than 3,000 aircraft in total, many of which were trainers or obsolete designs. The gap was not just numerical, it was doctrinal and psychological. Germany had invested its national identity in its military prowess, while America had invested its in the pursuit of prosperity. The German leadership believed that, even if the United States were to enter a future conflict, the time it would take to convert its civilian industries, to retool its factories from making family sedans to making heavy bombers, would be measured in years. By then, they reasoned, the war in Europe would be long over, decided by the swift and decisive application of the power they already possessed. They saw the Atlantic Ocean not as a potential highway for American power, but as a great buffer, a moat that would ensure America's industrial might remained irrelevant until it was too late. This was the great illusion of the era, a profound misunderstanding of the nature of democratic will and industrial potential. Goering and his contemporaries saw the gleaming surface of American consumer culture and failed to recognize the immense, untapped power that lay just beneath. They saw the production of 1 million automobiles and did not see the latent capacity to produce 100,000 aircraft. They heard the talk of isolationism and did not hear the rising murmur of a nation that, when provoked, could unite with a singular and terrifying purpose. The confidence in Berlin was built on a foundation of observable facts, but it was a foundation that would soon be shaken to its core. The laughter that greeted the notion of America as a military power would, in the fullness of time, be silenced by a sound they could not yet imagine: the drone of tens of thousands of engines, a river of aluminum and steel flowing from the very factories they had so casually dismissed, a sound that would begin as a distant hum and grow into a roar that would fill the skies of Europe. The age of illusions was drawing to a close, and a new age of industrial reality was about to dawn. The spark and the proclamation. The 7th of December, 1941 was a Sunday. For most Americans, it was a day of rest, of family gatherings, of quiet contemplation, a peaceful interlude before the start of another working week. The nation was officially at peace, an island of neutrality in a world increasingly consumed by conflict. The wars in Europe and Asia were distant tragedies, headlines in newspapers and somber reports on the radio, but they lacked the immediacy of a direct threat. The vastness of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans provided a sense of security, a belief that the troubles of the old world could be kept at arm's length. That belief was shattered in a matter of hours. The news from Pearl Harbor came as a profound shock, a jarring and unwelcome intrusion into the nation's sense of protected tranquility. The details were initially scarce, confused, but the core message was brutally clear. American territory had been attacked, its naval forces had suffered a heavy blow, and the nation was, in an instant, thrust from its position of observer to that of a principal combatant. The psychological impact was immense. The debates that had divided the country for years, the fierce arguments between isolationists and interventionists, evaporated overnight. The attack forged a unity of purpose that had been absent for decades. The shock quickly gave way to a cold, hard resolve. The sleeping giant, as a Japanese admiral would later lament, had been awoken. In Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was electric with crisis. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had for years carefully navigated the treacherous waters of public opinion, working to prepare the nation for a storm he saw gathering on the horizon, now had a mandate for action. The following day, he addressed a joint session of Congress and the nation. His voice, calm but firm, resonated from every radio in the country, describing the 7th of December as a date which will live in infamy. He asked for a declaration of war, and Congress granted it with near unanimous consent. But it was in a subsequent address, a fireside chat delivered directly to the American people, that he truly framed the challenge that lay ahead. He spoke not only of military strategy, but of industrial might. He knew that the war would not be won by soldiers and sailors alone. It would be won in the factories, the foundries, and on the assembly lines. It was in this context that he made a proclamation that seemed, to many at the time, to be born of sheer fantasy. He called upon the American industry to produce an unprecedented number of armaments, and he set a specific, staggering goal for the aviation industry: the production of 50,000 airplanes in the coming year. 50,000. The number was so immense, so far beyond the existing capacity of the entire world's aircraft manufacturers combined, that it was met with widespread disbelief. In 1941, the entire American aircraft industry had produced just under 20,000 planes, and many of those were light trainers. The idea of more than doubling that output, while simultaneously converting to more complex and powerful combat models, seemed an impossible dream. To the nation's enemies, it was laughable. German and Japanese leaders dismissed it as hollow propaganda, the blustering of a desperate politician trying to rally a nation that was, in their view, wholly unprepared for the realities of total war. They had spent a decade meticulously building their war machines, and they believed their head start was insurmountable. Even within the United States, many industry leaders were privately skeptical. They understood the enormous complexities involved, the sourcing of raw materials, the construction of new factories, the training of millions of new workers, the retooling of entire industries. The automobile industry, the logical candidate for such a massive undertaking, was built on a model of efficiency for a completely different kind of product. A car had thousands of parts. A heavy bomber had hundreds of thousands. The precision required was of a different order of magnitude. But Roosevelt's proclamation was not just a production target. It was a psychological weapon. It was a statement of intent, a declaration to the world, and more importantly, to the American people themselves, of the scale of their own potential. It was a challenge to the engineers, the workers, the managers, and the financiers of the nation. He was not just asking for planes. He was asking for a miracle of production, a testament to the power of a free and united people. He framed the effort not as a burden, but as a shared cause, calling America the arsenal of democracy. This powerful phrase captured the essence of the new national mission: to harness the country's immense economic power, to defend not just its own shores, but the very idea of freedom itself. The proclamation of 50,000 airplanes became a rallying cry. It transformed the abstract concept of war into a tangible goal that every citizen could understand. It was a number that could be envisioned, a mountain that could be climbed. The initial skepticism soon began to fade, replaced by a surge of patriotic determination. The question was no longer, can we do it, but how do we begin? The spark of Pearl Harbor had ignited a fire of national will, and Roosevelt's audacious proclamation had channeled that fire into a single, focused beam of industrial energy. The world, both friend and foe, would now watch to see if the nation of razor blades and refrigerators could indeed transform itself, to see if the promise of the arsenal of democracy could be made real. The assembly lines were about to be remade, and with them, the course of history. The arsenal of democracy awakens. President Roosevelt's call for 50,000 airplanes a year was more than a challenge. It was an act of faith in the American system of free enterprise, a system that would now be tested as never before. The task was monumental, requiring a level of government-industry cooperation and national mobilization unseen in the country's history. The first step was to create a framework for this colossal undertaking. The War Production Board, or WPB, was established in January 1942, granted sweeping powers to direct and coordinate the nation's industrial output. Its role was to be the central nervous system of the arsenal of democracy, ensuring that the finite resources of steel, aluminum, rubber, and manpower were funneled towards the war effort with maximum efficiency. This meant a radical reordering of the American economy. The production of civilian goods, the very things that had been the subject of Goering's derision, was drastically curtailed. The manufacture of new automobiles for the public ceased entirely. Factories that had once churned out vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and washing machines were told to retool for the production of machine guns, artillery shells, and aircraft components. It was a national pivot from a consumer economy to a military one, and it happened with breathtaking speed. The heart of this transformation was the automobile industry. Detroit, the global center of mass production, became the epicenter of the new war economy. The giants of the industry, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, were tasked with applying their legendary efficiency to the far more complex world of aviation. The most famous example of this was the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by the Ford Motor Company. Conceived by Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius, Willow Run was designed to be an assembly line for airplanes, specifically the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. It was a project of staggering ambition. The main building alone was half a mile long and a quarter of a mile wide, the largest factory under a single roof in the world. The goal was not just to build bombers, but to build them at a rate previously thought impossible, 1 per hour. The initial challenges were immense. The transition was not as simple as swapping one blueprint for another. The tolerances in aircraft manufacturing were far stricter than in automobile production. The workforce, initially inexperienced in aviation, had to be trained from scratch. The complex supply chains for hundreds of thousands of individual parts had to be established. For a time, the project struggled, earning the nickname "Will It Run?" But the persistence of the engineers and workers prevailed. They ironed out the kinks, streamlined the processes, and by 1944, the promise was fulfilled. A gleaming, 4-engine B-24 Liberator was indeed rolling off the massive assembly line approximately every hour. Willow Run became a symbol of America's industrial awakening, a physical embodiment of the nation's ability to turn its commercial prowess into military power. Yet, this story was not just about machines and factories. It was profoundly human. The mobilization for war created a massive labor shortage. Millions of men were joining the armed forces, leaving a vacuum on the home front. This vacuum was filled by one of the most significant social shifts in American history. Millions of women, who had previously been confined to domestic roles or a narrow range of professions, streamed into the factories. They became welders, riveters, electricians, and mechanics. They learned to read blueprints, operate heavy machinery, and assemble the complex components of warplanes. This phenomenon was personified by the cultural icon of Rosie the Riveter, a composite image of a strong, determined female factory worker, flexing her muscle under the slogan, "We can do it." Rosie was more than a poster. She was a reality in every factory across the land. These women proved that they were not only capable of doing the work, but excelled at it, often bringing a level of precision and dedication that impressed even the most skeptical foreman. Their contribution was not just valuable, it was indispensable. Without the Rosies, the production targets set by Roosevelt would have remained a fantasy. This industrial army was a diverse coalition of Americans. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the country, came together. Farmers learned to rivet. School teachers learned to wire electrical systems. It was a collective effort that transcended class, race, and gender, all unified by a common purpose. The scale of the achievement was staggering. By 1944, the 50,000 plane-a-year goal was not just met, it was shattered. American factories produced an astonishing 96,318 aircraft in that single year alone. That was more than double the combined output of Germany and Japan. Over the course of the war, from 1940 to 1945, the total number would approach 300,000 aircraft. It was a torrent of air power, an industrial flood that the Axis powers simply could not match. The established aviation companies, Boeing in Seattle, Lockheed and Douglas in California, Grumman on Long Island, expanded their facilities at an exponential rate. But the effort was national. A furniture factory in Michigan might find itself making wooden components for a Mosquito bomber, while a piano manufacturer in New York might be tasked with crafting precision parts for a fighter plane's wing. The entire industrial ecosystem of the nation was re-engineered. The arsenal of democracy had not just awakened. It was operating at a level that defied all previous conceptions of what was possible. The nation that had been mocked for its focus on creature comforts had revealed a deeper, harder core. It had demonstrated that its true strength lay not in the products it made, but in its unparalleled ability to organize, innovate, and produce on a massive scale. The hum of the refrigerator factory had been replaced by the deafening sound of riveting guns, a sound that would soon echo over the battlefields of the world. The forges of war, engineering the icons. The sheer quantity of aircraft produced by the United States was a decisive factor in the war, but it was the quality and specific capabilities of these machines that truly translated industrial might into battlefield dominance. American engineers and designers, backed by the full power of the nation's manufacturing base, created a family of aircraft that became legendary, each designed to fill a specific role in the vast and complex tapestry of modern air warfare. These were not just machines of war. They were masterpieces of industrial design, born from a uniquely American philosophy of ruggedness, reliability, and mass production. Among the most iconic of these was the Boeing B-17, aptly nicknamed the Flying Fortress. The B-17 was the embodiment of the American doctrine of high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. It was designed not for stealth, but for resilience. Bristling with 13 heavy machine guns, it was conceived to be a self-defending battleship of the skies, capable of flying in large, tightly packed formations and creating interlocking fields of fire that could fend off enemy fighters. Its 4 powerful Wright Cyclone engines allowed it to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold, placing it above the effective range of much anti-aircraft fire. The Fortress was renowned for its extraordinary toughness. Stories abounded of B-17s returning to their bases in England, with huge sections of their tails shot away, with engines out of commission, and riddled with hundreds of holes, yet still protecting their 10-man crews. Over 12,700 of these remarkable aircraft were built, primarily at Boeing's massive Plant 2 in Seattle, becoming the backbone of the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Its partner in this endeavor was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. While the B-17 was often praised for its ability to absorb punishment, the B-24 was the workhorse. With its distinctive twin-tail design and its long, slender Davis wing, the Liberator could fly faster, farther, and carry a heavier bomb load than the Fortress. This made it invaluable in the vast expanses of the Pacific Theater and for long-range missions over Europe. It was, however, a more challenging aircraft to fly in tight formation, and some crews felt it was less durable than the B-17. But its utility was undeniable. Thanks in large part to the incredible output of Ford's Willow Run facility, the B-24 became the most produced American military aircraft in history, with over 18,000 units manufactured. Together, the B-17 and B-24 formed a powerful 1-2 punch, the heavy hammers of the Strategic Air Campaign. In the realm of fighters, the initial American designs were solid, if not always spectacular. But as the war progressed, a new generation of aircraft emerged that would dominate the skies. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a perfect example of the American approach. It was huge for a single-engine fighter, built around the powerful and complex Pratt and Whitney double Wasp radial engine. It was heavy, exceptionally well armed, with 8 50-caliber machine guns, and incredibly durable, able to withstand damage that would have destroyed its more fragile adversaries. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and while it couldn't outmaneuver the nimble German fighters at certain altitudes, it could outdive almost anything, and its sheer firepower was devastating. It excelled as a high-altitude escort, and later, when adapted for ground attack, became one of the most effective fighter bombers of the war, a flying tank that could clear the way for advancing ground forces. While the Thunderbolt was the brawler, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning was the innovator. Its radical twin-boom design, with the pilot housed in a central nacelle, was unlike anything else in the sky. It was fast, powerful, and versatile. Its armament was concentrated in the nose, eliminating the need for convergence firing and making it a highly accurate gun platform. In Europe, its distinctive silhouette was a welcome sight for bomber crews. But it was in the Pacific that the fork-tailed devil, as the Germans called it, truly shone. Its long range and twin-engine reliability made it the ideal fighter for the immense distances of that theater, where it was flown by America's top aces, Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. For the naval war in the Pacific, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat was a game-changer. Grumman, known for building tough, reliable carrier aircraft, designed the Hellcat specifically to defeat the formidable Japanese Zero. It was not as agile as its opponent, but it was much faster, could climb more rapidly, was far more heavily armed, and crucially, was built like a tank, with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that gave its pilots a fighting chance to survive if they were hit. The Hellcat was easy to fly and easy to land on a carrier, allowing a flood of newly trained naval aviators to become effective combat pilots quickly. It entered service in 1943 and immediately established air superiority, achieving an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio. These were just a few of the icons forged in the crucible of war. There were others, like the rugged North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, famous for the Doolittle raid, and the versatile Douglas C-47 Dakota, the transport plane that became the logistical backbone of the entire Allied war effort. Each of these aircraft represented a triumph of engineering and a testament to the industrial ecosystem that supported them. From the mines that produced the aluminum ore to the factories that assembled the final product, millions of hands and minds contributed to their creation. The sky over Europe and the Pacific was about to become the stage for these new titans of the air, products of a nation that had been underestimated, a nation that was now showing the world what it could truly build when its mind was set to a single, unshakable purpose. The razor blade industry had indeed learned to make something new. The game changer, the Mustang. In the grand orchestra of American air power, each aircraft played a vital part. The B-17 was the resilient heart of the bomber formations, the P-47, the powerful percussion. But if one machine could be called the lead violin, the instrument that introduced a new and decisive melody to the symphony of war, it was the North American P-51 Mustang. The story of the Mustang is a remarkable tale of transatlantic cooperation, engineering brilliance, and the transformative power of a single, perfect pairing of airframe and engine. Its journey from a speculative design to the master of the European skies was one of the pivotal developments of the entire conflict. The aircraft was not initially conceived for the U.S. Army Air Forces. In 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, a relatively young company, to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters under license for the Royal Air Force. The lead designer at North American, Edgar Schmood, confidently countered that he could design and build a superior aircraft in less time than it would take to set up the P-40 production line. The British, desperate for modern fighters, agreed, on the condition that a prototype be ready in a mere 120 days. It was an audacious timeline, but the team at North American delivered. The prototype, known as the NA-73X, was rolled out in an incredible 117 days. It was a beautiful aircraft, featuring an advanced laminar flow wing, designed to reduce drag and increase speed. When it entered service with the RAF, it was a good, solid, low to medium altitude fighter and reconnaissance plane. It was fast and handled well, but it had a significant limitation. Its American-made Allison V1, 1710 engine, suffered from a dramatic loss of performance at altitudes above 15,000 feet. This made it unsuitable for the high-altitude bomber escort missions that were becoming increasingly critical to the air war over Germany. For a time, it seemed the Mustang would be relegated to a secondary role. The U.S. Army Air Forces used it primarily for ground attack and reconnaissance, valuable missions, but not the one for which it was destined. The turning point came not from an American initiative, but from a flash of insight in Britain. A Rolls-Royce test pilot, after flying the Mustang, noted that the excellent airframe felt like it was begging for a better engine, specifically the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane. This was the same engine being produced under license in the United States by the Packard Motor Car Company for use in other aircraft. The idea was simple but revolutionary. What if they put the Merlin into the Mustang? The marriage of the American airframe and the British-designed, American-built engine was a stroke of genius. The Packard 51, 1650 Merlin, with its advanced two-stage, two-speed supercharger, was a perfect match for the Mustang's aerodynamic design. The conversion transformed the aircraft. The already fast P-51 became a world beater. Its service ceiling leaped from a modest level to over 40,000 feet. Its speed at high altitude was exceptional. The good medium-altitude fighter had become the undisputed king of the high-altitude dogfight. It was now faster than any German piston engine fighter, including the formidable Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109. But speed and altitude were only part of the equation. The final piece of the puzzle was range. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was faltering in late 1943, precisely because of this issue. Bombers flying deep into enemy territory had to proceed beyond the range of their fighter escorts. For hundreds of miles, they were left to the mercy of the Luftwaffe, and the losses were becoming unsustainable. The P-47 and P-38 escorts simply did not have the legs to go all the way to targets like Berlin and back. The P-51, already an efficient design, was fitted with internal self-sealing fuel tanks and, crucially, the ability to carry external drop tanks under its wings. With these tanks, its combat radius was dramatically extended. A Mustang could now take off from a base in England, escort the B-17s and B-24s all the way to their targets deep inside Germany, engage in combat with the Luftwaffe, and fly all the way back. The impact of the long-range P-51 Mustang cannot be overstated. It fundamentally changed the calculus of the air war. The arrival of the Merlin-powered P-51B and D models in significant numbers in late 1943 and early 1944 spelled the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots could no longer wait for the American escorts to turn back for home. The "little friends," as the bomber crews called them, were now there for the entire journey. They met the German fighters as they rose to intercept, engaging them in swirling dogfights, long before they could reach the bomber streams. The Mustang pilots were given a new directive. They were not just to defend the bombers, but to actively seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, in the air or on the ground. They were unleashed. The sight of the P-51's distinctive silver fuselage and squared-off wings became a symbol of hope for the bomber crews and a harbinger of doom for the German Air Force. More than 15,000 Mustangs were produced during the war. It was an aircraft that combined speed, range, firepower, and maneuverability in a package that no other piston engine fighter of the era could match. It was the key that unlocked the full potential of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, allowing the industrial might of the United States to be brought to bear directly on the heart of the German war machine. The game had been changed, not by a committee or a grand strategy, but by the brilliant fusion of an American airframe and a British engine, creating a weapon that would sweep the skies clean and pave the way for final victory. Crossing the Channel. The 8th Air Force gathers. The industrial miracle taking place across the Atlantic was only one half of the equation. For the 300,000 aircraft rolling off American assembly lines to have any impact on the war in Europe, they had to be delivered to the front lines, and crews had to be trained to fly and maintain them. This led to the creation of one of the largest and most complex military organizations in history, the 8th Air Force. Its mission was simple in concept, but staggering in its logistical complexity: to establish a massive force of American heavy bombers and escort fighters in the United Kingdom, and from there, to launch a sustained, strategic air campaign against the industrial heartland of Germany. The story of the 8th Air Force is one of scale, of human endeavor, and of a remarkable cultural encounter. Beginning in early 1942, a steady stream of young Americans began to cross the Atlantic. They were pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, mechanics, and support staff, most of them volunteers, drawn from every state in the Union. They were the human component of the arsenal of democracy, the men who would take the machines built in factories in California, Michigan, and Texas into combat. Their destination was the east of England, a region of flat farmlands, quaint villages, and unpredictable weather, which would soon be transformed into a sprawling network of airbases. The Friendly Invasion, as it was dubbed, was a massive construction project. Entirely new airfields, each a small city in its own right, seemed to spring up overnight from the pastoral landscape of East Anglia. They were vast complexes of concrete runways, hangars, maintenance depots, barracks, and control towers. At its peak, there were over 100 American air bases operating in the region, a concentration of air power unlike any the world had ever seen. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of young, boisterous Americans was a culture shock for the local British population, who had already endured years of war, rationing, and the threat of invasion. The Americans were seen as overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, with their pockets full of money, their easy confidence, and their seemingly endless supply of things like chocolate and nylon stockings, which had long since disappeared from British shelves. Yet, despite the initial friction and cultural misunderstandings, deep bonds were formed. The Americans were welcomed into local pubs and homes. They dated local girls, played baseball on village greens, and shared their rations with children. They were a visible, noisy, and optimistic reminder that they were no longer alone in the fight. They brought with them a sense of hope and the tangible promise of America's vast resources. For the air crews themselves, life in England was a strange mix of routine and extreme peril. The days were spent in training, aircraft maintenance, and briefings, studying maps and intelligence reports, preparing for the next mission. The nights might be spent at a local pub, listening to the Glenn Miller Orchestra on the radio, or writing letters home, trying to convey a reality that was impossible to truly describe. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, far from home and facing a daunting future. The central challenge of the early 8th Air Force was one of learning. The American doctrine of high-altitude daylight precision bombing was, at this point, an unproven theory. The idea was to use the advanced Norden bomb sight to hit specific, strategic targets: factories, railway yards, submarine pens, with surgical accuracy, thereby crippling the German war economy with minimal collateral damage. This stood in contrast to the British RAF's strategy of nighttime area bombing. But to fly these missions in daylight, over heavily defended enemy territory, was to invite the full, focused fury of the Luftwaffe and Germany's formidable anti-aircraft defenses. The early missions, flown in 1942 and early 1943, were a brutal education. The bomber crews learned about the harsh realities of high-altitude flight, The deep, biting cold of the unpressurized cabins, the constant need for oxygen, the threat of frostbite. They learned the terrifying geometry of anti-aircraft fire, the flak, which burst in puffs of black smoke around their formations, sending shrapnel tearing through the thin aluminum skin of their aircraft. Most of all, they learned to fear the German fighters. The Luftwaffe's pilots were experienced, skilled, and fighting to defend their homeland. Their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s were deadly opponents, and they pressed their attacks with skill and determination. The bomber formations, with their interlocking fields of fire from the 50 caliber machine guns, could put up a formidable defense, but the losses were heavy. Each mission was a grueling 8 to 10 hour ordeal, a journey into the heart of enemy territory, from which not everyone would return. The empty bunks in the Nissen huts after a mission were a silent, somber testament to the price being paid. Yet they kept flying. They flew with a mixture of courage, fatalism, and a profound sense of duty to the men flying beside them in the formation. The bond between the 10 members of a bomber crew was one of the most powerful forces in the air war, a small family unit that depended entirely on each other for survival. The 8th Air Force was gathering its strength, absorbing the harsh lessons of combat, and steadily growing in size and experience. The bases in England were becoming packed with B-17s and B-24s, and new fighter groups were arriving with their P-47s and P-38s. The stage was being set for the main act of the air war. The full weight of American industrial power had been gathered and positioned just across the English Channel. The question that remained was whether this immense force, built at such great cost and effort, could achieve its objective and break the back of the German war machine from the air. The skies over the continent would soon provide the answer. The crucible of 1943, the unescorted raids. The year 1943 became the crucible for the 8th Air Force and its guiding doctrine of daylight precision bombing. It was a year of immense courage, profound sacrifice, and harsh lessons learned in the cold, hostile skies deep inside Germany. With the force in England growing daily, the American commanders felt ready to escalate their campaign, to strike not just at the periphery of the enemy's territory, but at its very industrial heart. The strategy was audacious: to send large formations of unescorted B-17 and B-24 bombers to attack critical targets hundreds of miles beyond the range of their fighter cover. The theory held that the tightly packed combat box formations of heavy bombers could defend themselves with their combined firepower. 1943 would be the ultimate test of that theory. The summer and autumn of that year saw a series of deep penetration raids that would be forever etched in the history of air power. These missions targeted the nerve centers of German industry: aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and synthetic oil refineries. One of the most ambitious of these was the mission of August 17, 1943, a complex, two-pronged assault on the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Regensburg and the vital ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. Ball bearings were a critical bottleneck in the German war economy. Nearly every piece of moving machinery, from a tank turret to an airplane engine, depended on them. The theory was that destroying these plants could paralyze German production. The raid was a masterpiece of planning, but a brutal experience in execution. The force destined for Regensburg would fly on to bases in North Africa, while the Schweinfurt force would have to fight its way in and back out again. As soon as the Allied fighter escorts, with their limited range, were forced to turn back over the German border, the Luftwaffe pounced. Wave after wave of German fighters, coordinated by ground controllers, tore into the bomber formations. The German pilots were skilled and determined, employing new tactics, including head-on attacks, to break up the combat boxes and isolate individual bombers. The sky became a chaotic, three-dimensional battlefield, filled with the smoke of cannon shells, The crisscrossing lines of tracer fire, and the constant, chilling sight of great aircraft faltering, trailing smoke, and beginning their final, long descent. The American gunners, bundled in their electrically heated suits against the sub-zero temperatures, fought back with grim determination, their 50-caliber machine guns filling the air with a deafening roar. They claimed many German fighters, but the onslaught was relentless. The mission saw 60 heavy bombers lost, each with a crew of 10 men. It was a staggering price to pay. The bombers that reached the targets delivered their payloads with precision, causing significant disruption to the factories, but the cost raised serious questions about the sustainability of such operations. The darkest day for the 8th Air Force, however, was yet to come. On October 14, 1943, a date that would become known as Black Thursday, the bombers returned to Schweinfurt in an attempt to finish the job. This time, the Luftwaffe was even better prepared. It threw everything it had at the 291 B-17s that made up the attacking force. The battle was a repeat of the August raid, but even more intense. For hours, the American crews endured a running gauntlet of attacks. The result was a catastrophe. Another 60 bombers were lost over the continent, with many more damaged beyond repair or crashing in England upon their return. In the span of a single week of operations, the 8th Air Force had lost 148 bombers and nearly 1,500 airmen. The loss rate was simply unsustainable. A crewman's chance of completing his tour of 25 missions was statistically grim. The theory of the self-defending bomber formation had been proven tragically wrong in the face of a determined, well-equipped fighter defense. The courage of the crews was not in doubt. They had flown into the heart of the enemy's defenses and had done so with professionalism and bravery. But courage alone could not overcome the fundamental tactical disadvantage of being unescorted. A painful realization dawned upon the American command. The strategic bombing campaign could not succeed, and might not even survive, without a fighter that could go all the way to the target and back with the bombers. The great industrial machine in America had produced the heavy bombers, the hammers of the air war. But it had not yet provided the one tool that was desperately needed to allow those hammers to strike effectively: a long-range escort fighter. The deep penetration raids were temporarily halted. The 8th Air Force paused to rebuild, to absorb the terrible losses, and to re-evaluate its strategy. It was a somber and difficult period. The morale of the bomber crews, while not broken, was severely strained. The future of the entire daylight bombing concept hung in the balance, but help was on the way. Across the Atlantic, the Packard factories were ramping up production of the Merlin engine. In the North American aviation plants in California and Texas, a sleek, revolutionary fighter was rolling off the assembly lines in ever-increasing numbers. The crucible of 1943 had been a painful but necessary lesson. It had exposed the critical weakness in the Allied air strategy and had created an urgent, undeniable demand for the one aircraft that could solve it: the P-51 Mustang. Its arrival in the European theater at the end of the year would not just change the odds. It would change the entire war in the air. The sacrifices of Black Thursday had paved the way for a new dawn. The turning of the tide, the great air battles of 1944, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in the European theater of operations at the close of 1943 was not merely the introduction of a new piece of equipment. It was the catalyst for a fundamental shift in the nature of the air war. The dark days of the unescorted raids were over. The new year, 1944, would see the 8th Air Force, now fully equipped with a fighter that could protect its bombers all the way to Berlin and back, go on the offensive with a vengeance. The strategic goal was formalized under the code name Operation Point Blank. Its objective was brutally simple: to achieve air superiority over the continent by systematically destroying the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in the air and on the ground. This meant not only shooting down its fighters, but also destroying the factories that built them, the airfields where they were based, and the refineries that produced their fuel. The commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces, General Carl Toohey Spaatz, issued a new and aggressive directive to his fighter pilots. Their primary mission was no longer simply to stay close to the bombers and fend off attackers. It was now to seek out, engage, and destroy the enemy. The Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings were unleashed. They were to fly ahead of the bomber streams, sweep the skies clear of interceptors, and then, after the bombers had passed, descend to treetop level and attack Luftwaffe airfields, strafing parked aircraft, hangars, and fuel depots. It was a declaration of total war against the German air arm. The first major test of this new strategy came in late February 1944, during a period that became known as the Big Week. In a series of coordinated massive raids, the 8th Air Force, in conjunction with the 15th Air Force, based in Italy, and the RAF, struck at the heart of the German aircraft industry. Over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by nearly as many fighters, flew day after day to targets deep within Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, and the result was a series of titanic air battles, the largest the world had ever seen. The sky over Germany became a vast arena of combat. The bomber crews, their confidence bolstered by the constant presence of their little friends, pressed onto their targets with renewed determination. The fighter pilots, reveling in the superior performance of their Mustangs, engaged the German fighters in swirling dogfights that raged from 30,000 feet down to the deck. For the Luftwaffe, it was a disastrous period. They were forced to engage in a battle of attrition they could not win. They shot down a significant number of Allied bombers and fighters, but their own losses were catastrophic, particularly among their experienced pilots. The German Air Force had a superb system for training new pilots, but it could not replace the years of combat experience possessed by its veteran leaders, the Expert 10. As these veterans were lost, they were replaced by younger, less experienced pilots, who were often no match for the well-trained and increasingly confident Allied aviators. This attritional battle continued throughout the spring of 1944. The Americans kept coming, day after day, in ever-increasing numbers. The industrial might of the United States was now being felt in the skies of Europe. For every aircraft the Luftwaffe lost, the Allies could replace it with 5 or 10 more. For every experienced pilot Germany lost, a dozen more were finishing their training in America. The German aircraft industry, despite being under constant attack, continued to produce fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 at an impressive rate. They even introduced the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft, far faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter. When it appeared, it caused considerable alarm. However, it was a classic case of too little, too late. Its production was hampered by the bombing, its advanced jet engines were unreliable, and there was a critical shortage of the specialized fuel it required. Most importantly, there were not enough experienced pilots left to fly it effectively. Allied fighter pilots quickly developed tactics to counter the jet threat, primarily by attacking them during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. By the spring of 1944, the tide had irrevocably turned. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. It could still put up a fight, but it could no longer effectively challenge Allied control of the air. The systematic destruction of its fuel production facilities meant that even when aircraft and pilots were available, they were often grounded for lack of gasoline. The loss rate for German fighter pilots reached an unsustainable 25% per month. The sky, which had once been the exclusive domain of the Luftwaffe, was now owned by the Allies. This air supremacy was the essential prerequisite for the event that would seal the fate of the conflict in Western Europe, the D-Day landings. On June 6, 1944, when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, they did so under a vast and unchallenged umbrella of air power. The Luftwaffe was virtually absent from the sky over the invasion fleet and the beachheads. Allied fighters and bombers were able to roam at will, supporting the ground troops, disrupting enemy reinforcements, and ensuring that the foothold in France could be secured and expanded. Goering's vaunted Luftwaffe had been broken. It had been defeated not just by superior numbers, but by a combination of strategic vision, technological innovation like the P-51, and the relentless application of industrial power. The great air battles of 1944 had been the turning point, a brutal and decisive campaign that had cleared the skies and opened the door to the final chapter of the war. The unchallenged sky, supremacy, in 1945. By the beginning of 1945, the concept of a contested sky over Germany had become a memory. The great air battles of the previous year had effectively shattered the Luftwaffe as a cohesive fighting force. What remained was a scattered collection of units, hamstrung by a catastrophic lack of fuel, a dearth of experienced pilots, and the relentless, crushing weight of Allied air supremacy. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a highway for Allied air power, a vast, open space through which bombers and fighters could travel to almost any destination on the continent with near impunity. The scale of Allied air operations in this final phase of the war was difficult to comprehend. On any given day with clear weather, it was not uncommon for thousands of Allied aircraft to be operating over Germany. The sky was filled with a constant, deep drone of engines, a sound that became the daily reality for the German population. The phrase, "blackened skies," once a piece of prophetic rhetoric, had become a visual reality, not from smoke, but from the sheer density of the aircraft formations that cast a constant, moving shadow across the landscape below. The 8th Air Force's B-17s and B-24s continued their daylight strategic missions, but the nature of their targeting had changed. With most of the primary industrial targets already heavily damaged or destroyed, the focus shifted to the German transportation network. Railway yards, bridges, canals, and marshalling yards were systematically targeted to paralyze the movement of German troops and supplies. The goal was to isolate the battlefield and prevent the German army from effectively responding to the Allied advances on the ground from both the west and the east. This relentless campaign was a round-the-clock operation. By day, the American formations, vast rivers of silver aircraft, would methodically attack their assigned targets. By night, the sky would belong to the heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, the Lancasters and Halifaxes, which continued their campaign against industrial centers and urban areas. There was no respite. The pressure was constant, systematic, and overwhelming. The escort fighters, with the Luftwaffe largely swept from the sky, took on new roles. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, their primary mission of air-to-air combat largely complete, became fearsome ground attack aircraft. They roamed far and wide in fighter sweeps, descending to low altitude to attack any target of opportunity. They strafed troop columns, supply trucks, and, most devastatingly, locomotives. By disrupting the rail system, they brought the German war economy to a grinding halt. The once mighty German military machine was being starved and immobilized from the air. The technological disparity was also on full display. Germany had its advanced jets and rocket planes, but they were a mere handful of marvels in a sky dominated by tens of thousands of conventional Allied aircraft. The Me-262, while formidable, was a rare and precious asset that could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every jet the Germans could get into the air, the Allies could field 100 Mustangs. The industrial output of the razor blade industry had created a numerical advantage that no amount of technological sophistication could overcome. One of the most telling signs of the Luftwaffe's collapse was the state of its pilot training. In the final months of the war, young German pilots were being sent into combat with only a fraction of the flight hours that their Allied counterparts received. They were flying technologically complex aircraft with minimal experience, an almost certain recipe for disaster. They were brave, but they were being sent on a hopeless mission against an enemy that owned the sky. The culmination of this air supremacy was on full display during major ground offensives, like the crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945. The operation was preceded by a massive aerial bombardment that obliterated the German defenses. As the ground troops advanced, they were supported by a continuous canopy of fighters and fighter bombers that acted as a form of flying artillery, scouting ahead and eliminating any pockets of resistance. The war in the air had evolved from a struggle for control to the direct application of overwhelming and unopposed power. On April 16, 1945, in one of the final massive raids of the war in Europe, a combined force of over 1,200 B-17s and B-24s attacked targets in and around the capital city of Berlin. They flew in broad daylight, in clear skies, and met only sporadic and ineffective resistance. It was a final, powerful demonstration of how completely the tables had turned. The city that was the heart of the regime, that had once boasted of its invincible air force, was now defenseless against the fleets of aircraft that had been built in the factories it had so deeply underestimated. For Hermann Goering, the architect of the Luftwaffe, these final months were a period of complete marginalization. His boasts from the early years of the war, his promises that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich, now seemed like a bitter joke. His air force was gone, its command structure in disarray. He had lost all credibility. The unchallenged sky over Germany in 1945 was the ultimate refutation of his hubris. It was a sky filled with the products of a nation he had mocked, a testament to the fact that the war had been won not only on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. Legacy of the assembly line. As the conflict in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, the skies fell quiet for the first time in years. The constant drone of engines faded, replaced by an unfamiliar silence. In that silence, it was possible to reflect on the immense and transformative events that had transpired. The war had been a story of titanic struggles, on land and at sea, of ideological clashes and human endurance. But interwoven through it all was the story of the air, and at the heart of that story was the unprecedented achievement of American industry. The final tally was a testament to this achievement. From 1940 to 1945, the United States had produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft. This number, once an impossible fantasy, had become a world-altering reality. It was a victory of logistics, engineering, and above all, of production. The war had proven, in the starkest possible terms, that industrial capacity was as decisive a weapon as any army. The United States entered the war as a nation known for its consumer goods, and it emerged as the world's undisputed industrial and military superpower. The phrase, "arsenal of democracy," coined by Roosevelt in a time of crisis, had been made manifest. The nation had successfully harnessed its vast, decentralized and competitive industrial base, focusing it with a singular will on a common goal. It demonstrated that a democratic society, with its emphasis on individual freedom and enterprise, could, when united, outproduce the rigidly controlled, state-run economies of its totalitarian adversaries. The scale of the disparity at the war's end was telling. For every one German aircraft that was able to take to the skies, there were 5, 6, or even more Allied planes waiting to meet it. This overwhelming numerical superiority was the direct result of the production lines in places like Willow Run, Seattle, and Southern California. It was an advantage that ground down the highly skilled but numerically inferior German forces until they could no longer offer effective resistance. The legacy of this industrial mobilization extended far beyond the battlefield. It had a profound and lasting impact on American society. The war effort had pulled the nation decisively out of the Great Depression, creating millions of jobs and stimulating a period of economic growth that would continue for decades. The immense government investment in research and development, particularly in fields like aviation, electronics, and nuclear energy, laid the groundwork for the technological boom of the post-war era. The B-29 Superfortress program, for example, pushed the boundaries of aeronautical engineering, leading directly to the development of the modern passenger airliner. The social landscape of America was also permanently altered. The Rosie the Riveter phenomenon had a lasting effect on the role of women in the workforce. Millions of women had proven their capabilities in demanding, skilled jobs, challenging traditional notions of gender roles. While many returned to domestic life after the war, the door had been opened, and the idea of a woman's place being solely in the home was forever changed. The war also accelerated the migration of Americans from rural areas to industrial centers, further transforming the country into an urbanized industrial nation. The words of Hermann Goering, spoken with such confidence and derision before the war, now echoed with a deep and profound irony. The nation of razor blades and refrigerators had not been weakened by its consumer culture. In a way, it had been strengthened by it. The very skills that allowed America to mass-produce automobiles and appliances, the expertise in assembly line efficiency, supply chain management, and workforce organization, were the same skills that were turned with such devastating effect to the production of warplanes. The American genius was not for one or the other, but for the system of production itself. In the end, the story is a powerful lesson in the danger of underestimation. It is a reminder that the true strength of a nation is not always found in its visible military power, but in its latent potential, its adaptability, and the collective will of its people. The 300,000 aircraft that flew from American factories were more than just weapons of war. They were symbols of a national awakening, a demonstration that when faced with a profound threat, a nation of consumers could become a nation of builders, and a razor blade industry could indeed build the instruments that would reshape the history of the 20th century. The legacy of the assembly line was not just the victory it secured, but the world it helped to create.